Z.
I'm a pioneer. I'm an explorer.
R.
I'm a human, and I'm coming.
S.
I'm alive! My heart's big! It's got hot blood going through it fast! I like to fight too!
Zenith Radio Syndicate.
I got a life force. This is a human. This is what we look like. This is what we act like. This is what everybody was like before us. This is what I am. I'm a throwback. I'm here. I've got the fire of human liberty. I'm setting fires everywhere, and humans are carrying on everywhere.
Welcome back to Radio on the Internet. Today we have a very special meeting of frontal cortices. I would like to present to you Jeremiah Rothenberg Kushelowitz, Mario Keith, and your sideman, Music Library. They will be having talk about the nonsense that has happened since the previous nonsense. If you think this world is trying to make you crazy, you are probably correct.
So, yeah, lots happened since we last talked, huh? My gosh.
That's correct. It's like every other day. The plot thickens.
That's, yeah, it's definitely a nice way of putting it.
So why don't we, check out the plot?
So there was the re-emergence of Black Lives Matter as central to the national discourse. 2 high-profile police shootings happened in the same weekend, and then the Dallas sniper killings of the police officers. It wasn't that long ago. It was like a month and a half ago.
Let's talk about these damn shootings up in Dallas, okay? So, this nigga got killed in Louisiana. What y'all niggas shooting people for in Dallas? Them cops ain't shooting no damn body? Who is Friday, so I gotta have me in jail. Cause this Black Lives Matter shit getting on my nerves.
That definitely felt like there was an amplification, a national amplification of the intensity of the racial discourse at that point.
Maybe I'm jumping into this too early, but these obviously have been occurring like at a pretty rapid pace and through different narratives, whether it's like, black people versus white people versus black people, Mexicans versus white people, Muslims versus fucking everybody. It all seems very contrived to me. And this is just coming from somebody who, I don't have a huge deal of information to back this up. All I know is this could have happened like at any point. Why is it happening now? Like, what do you guys think?
2 main relationships here that are involved, and I think they're both different. One is a more vertical relationship between the people and the state, so that's sort of the tension between the people and the police. There's, of course, then an added racial dimension. That's the more horizontal axis that's involved here of different ethnicities in some type of tension together. But I think in terms of the police aspect, I was trying to actually get to some ground level facts about, are shootings by police on the rise, that type of scenario. And what I can get down to is it looks like there is a big punctuated jump after September 11th in terms of a rise of a more apparent police state. Of course, like there has always been a racial dynamic to police in this country. Some police groups do have their roots in things like slave patrol and that type of thing. But at the same time, we in this country were already on the move towards devolving a lot of that tension, I think, in some of the 20th century. But after September 11th, you have these 2 very specific trends that are in large part responsible for what is rightly perceived to be an amplification of a police state and a violent relationship growing between the police and the people that they're meant to protect and serve. And one is the militarization of the police, where all this old military gear is then passed directly on to the police departments. And not just that that gear is then used to physically dominate people, but that it also sets this relationship up that the police are a militarized force. So there's a psychology there. So then the second really key piece, I believe, is that After September 11th, more and more high-level police trainers and chiefs are going to Israel to learn from the Israeli Defense Forces, the domestic police forces, about counter-terrorism. And of course, because Israel has this ongoing occupation, police are not being trained in Israel to serve and protect necessarily. They're very likely being trained to figure out how to be effective occupiers.
But that doesn't answer the question of how this problem has become a race divide.
No.
These things may happen, but that's not the conversation we're having about it. There's a narrative that blames white people for all the stuff that happens in these communities.
So what's up, America? It's me again, Darnell Truther, here for another episode of Shit Ain't Right. You know what I'm saying? This one is about choices. Because people, they don't make the right choice. And then when they have to live with their choice, they want to blame the white dude for you making that choice. I don't buy that. You talk about you can't go get a job, nobody's hiring. Bullshit. I got a job. I just got up, filled out application, went to the interview and got the job. Nobody's gonna come knock on your door and give you anything. You have to work hard just like everybody else. Yes, slavery happened. Yes, there was racism in the 60s, 70s, and whatever else. Even now. This lady yesterday talked about she was in poverty. How the hell are you living in poverty? You have cable TV, you have your nails and feet done, you got your freaking weave done all the time. You know what I mean? You got fly-ass clothes, you wear Jordans, you go on vacations, you go to the club, you go to amusement parks, you go to movies, you go to the improv. How the hell are you in poverty? What do you mean you're in poverty? The white man got his foot on my neck. How? You have black presidents, black senators, black congressmen, black business owners. Hell, my cousin owns a business and she's very successful. Where's the white man with the gun in the front door telling her, don't go outside and be productive, don't do anything? Where's that white man at, Joe? Because I don't see him. I see you make a bad choice at a young age and had 4 or 5 kids and you can't do shit. You can't do what you want. How is that the white man's fault? How is that the white man's fault that your boyfriend goes and shoot up Tyrone or goes sell some crack to Tyrone and he gets locked up and now when he gets out, he can't do shit? He made the choice to do that. That's bullcrap. We got Herman Cain, we got Ben Carson, you got Don Lemon, little fake butt on CNN, you got Obama. You know black people that owns businesses. There's nobody keeping you down but yourself. You're your biggest friggin' enemy. Straight up. Everybody's messing with me because I'm black. That's trash, yo. You can do something. You can make a difference in any situation. But it's easy to point the finger, and the Democrats, the welfare system, they depend on that. Just like y'all depend on them, they depend on you to still be a slave and a sheep. It's easy to say the white man's holding you down. Yes, there are racist white people. Just like there's racist black people. Just like there's racist Latinos. Just like there's racism all over the place. But that does not mean you cannot get up in the morning and be productive every day. I do it. I live in the hood. I ain't special. You know what I'm saying? I might look like I'm smart. I am smart. But I might look like I have something. I'm from the slums, man. I'll show you what it look like. But I choose not to do that. I chose to graduate high school. I chose to go to the Marine Corps. I chose to go to college. I chose to get a job. I chose not to be in the street. I chose not to sell drugs. I chose not to shoot at Tyrone. I chose these things for myself. I have kids. I don't want them growing up like that. I want them to grow up with an ambitious mind. I want to do something in life. Y'all want to blame everything on cops and white man. But it's you.
That's preventing from becoming a discussion about the phenomenon of power differentials in society. And instead it's become an issue of cultural Marxism with privileged groups versus disadvantaged groups. It's a very divisive narrative that is exacerbating the mistrust between people that leads to policing. If you have a problem with the way police are treating your community, and your community is 4 times more likely to commit homicide, there may be problems in your community that have created this situation, one side of the situation. Low crime areas don't have anywhere near the police intervention and police abuse as high crime areas. Police understand the crime statistics in this country because that's a big part of understanding how to do their job. And the crime statistics unfortunately paint a picture of a certain unfortunate reality that also factors into the Black Lives Matter narrative. When critics of Black Lives Matter bring up the prevalence of black-on-black crime, they are treated as if that is not even a part of this conversation, as if it's just some red herring to lead the conversation elsewhere.
You got Don Lemon, little fake butt on CNN. That's bullcrap. That's trash, yo.
90% of black people that get killed are killed by black people. 7.6% are killed by white people. 82% of white people who die in homicides are killed by white people. 15% of white people that are victims of homicides are killed by black people. Black people commit 54.1 homicides per million, and white people commit 14.5 homicides per million.
Where are these numbers from, just for the record?
The Federal Bureau of Investigation. Blacks are killed by police at a rate of 6.2 per million, and white people are killed by police at a rate of 2.1 per million. So black people are 3 times more likely to get killed by police than white people. But to make that then a racial issue would have to assume that all these cops are white. The same statistics show that black and Hispanic officers are 3.3 times more likely to fire a gun during a police situation. In the Philando Castile shooting, in that case, the officer was a Hispanic officer. But that doesn't suit the narrative so well, so we leave out that Hispanic component. There's a organization that keeps track of all the deaths by police in the United States, and they have a category called unarmed black victim. And there's a quote from the Marshall Project that talks about how simply looking at whether someone is an unarmed black victim or not can be misleading because it doesn't show the full picture of the situation that happened. A passage from that document is as follows. The unarmed label is literally accurate, but frequently fails to convey highly charged policing situations. In a number of cases, if the victim ended up being unarmed, it was certainly not for a lack of trying. At least 5 black victims had reportedly tried to grab the officer's gun or had been beating the officer with his own equipment. Some were shot from accidental discharge triggered by their own assault on the officer. And 2 individuals in the unarmed black victim category were struck by stray bullets aimed at someone else in justified police shootings. If victims were not the intended targets, racism could have played no part in their deaths. In one such case, an undercover officer was conducting a sting operation in Mount Vernon. One of the gun traffickers jumped into the cop's car, stuck a pistol to his head, grabbed $2,400 and fled. The officer gave chase and opened fire after the thief again pointed his gun at him. 2 of the officer's bullets accidentally hit a 61-year-old bystander, killing him. The older man happened to be black, but his race had nothing to do with his tragic death. In another case, officers approached a car parked at a convenience store that had a homicide suspect in the passenger seat. The suspect opened fire, sending a bullet through the officer's shirt. The cops returned fire, killing the assailant as well as a woman in the driver's seat. That woman entered the database without qualification as an unarmed black victim.
I'm seeing that you're aggressive. You're ready to fucking assault me, so whoa, what the fuck? I'm not about to just sit here and try to talk to you. No, I'm about to get you to back the fuck up. And to me, I see that's how a lot of conflicts in black communities start. It starts with one person going fucking overboard, going crazy as shit, and then the next person, getting defensive and has to go equally crazy as shit because now they're in fear of their life from this aggressive psychopathic motherfucker. And granted, it didn't happen here, but let this had been the same situation between 2 black people in pick whatever urban, metropolitan city that you want on the streets. If this shit had happened, what would be the next thing? Fighting, shooting. Somebody gets stabbed, somebody getting stomped out, somebody running off to get their car and coming back and slamming into a fucking crowd. If shit happens all the fucking time, back to back, it's almost predictable. It's almost like you feeling like fucking That's So Raven. This shit's so predictable, like you can see in the future, oh, I know exactly how this shit's gonna play out. And it does it every time. So when you're behaving so fucking irrational, so fucking threatening, how do you expect the other party to react? All right, now we get into the core issue that Black Lives Matter, usually talk about, which is police brutality. Police, always escalating, to shooting black people. Imagine, I know not all the time, but imagine that someone comes up to a cop. Let's say you're a cop. Let's say someone comes up to you acting like this. What the fuck is going to be your reaction? Personally, my reaction is going to be, I'm gonna give you one time, back the fuck up, or I'm about to pull my gun and shit's about to happen. Because right now, I can't trust you. I can't reason with you. I can't expect any type of conversation for you. Now, granted, I'm not excusing police brutality. There are a lot of situations where cops just completely fuck up. All right, where they're actually the agitators. They're actually the aggressors. Where they actually escalate situations. But in many cases, it is the alternative party, which commonly is black people escalating the fucking situation for no goddamn reason.
The most recent case that has become publicized is Corinne Gaines, and she was pointing a shotgun at the police officers. She shot at the police officers. A shot out ensued, and her 5-year-old child got shot because she was holding it during a shootout. If you want to really protect your child, you don't even start firing guns at police officers in the fucking first place. There are choices that lead to very dangerous situations for all involved.
Clearly, but that exists on many different sides too, meaning that you have a SWAT team in a private homes for nonviolent or even victimless crimes. That's a choice.
That doesn't fit the scenario here because the police were serving warrants for both Corinne Gaines and her boyfriend at the same time. The boyfriend had a prior conviction for attempted murder. He owned firearms illegally. They found out he was selling heroin in that same apartment they were raising their child in. He was being served a warrant for domestic violence at the time. You know these things about people when you're serving a warrant on them. They know they were going into a potentially dangerous situation. It's still unfortunate when these happen, but the narrative of bloodthirsty, racist police officers falls apart when you look at a lot of the competing evidence as well. It paints a picture of a highly charged situation where life or death decisions are made instantly, and mistakes are made, yes, but are those mistakes always racist? That's the question.
No, clearly, a lot of the problem here is that the way the conversation has been created as this horizontal social racism problem of individual people, whether they're police officers or civilians, racial dynamics amongst them. And really what needs to be talked about in all of this is what I would call structural racism. That's a vertical thing, and sort of similarly in the way that you talked about the Philando Castile case, where it's obviously not so easy that it's just some racist white cop killing some black guy because the white cop is racist. That's obviously not what that was. At the same time, we have to understand how we got to this situation, and that there has been a long structural conspiracy against Americans of African descent. And yes, we've made great strides in this country. But if you combine the economic warfare of NAFTA, neoliberalism, of the looting and the evisceration of our urban cores in the late 20th century, combined with the so-called drug war, which anybody who knows anything about Iran-Contra or the Golden Triangle or the role of drug money in black operations in the intelligence world, all the way back to the Russell Trust and the British Empire's use of opium as a weapon. This drug war is a weapon. It's a weapon against specific communities. It's not just against black folks, but black folks have been hit the hardest by this so-called drug war. And of course, you go back to Vietnam, and it's very similar. Nowadays, it's a similar type of scenario as the Vietnam War, where you see this aggressive warfare that resulted in the amplification of more and more deadly and destructive drugs in urban neighborhoods. Same thing with the post-9/11 aggressive warfare in Afghanistan. Of course, it's not just affecting black communities. In many ways, the opiates are affecting white communities more intensely. So that's part of this. And then you also have a political conspiracy against the black folks. And this includes the sort of race pimping of the Democrats, but also the race baiting of the Republicans. And in the midst of all of that, the real authentic aspirations and desires of American people of African descent gets lost. And then thirdly and finally, you have the problem of a cultural conspiracy, where you had very strong community and familial bonds in the African American community for much of the 20th century. And so part of it is the degradation of the drug war and the sort of and the falling away of moral principles that goes along with that. But there's also like high level corporatist commodification of black art and culture. If you look at what happened to hip hop, where it went from being Public Enemy or the sort of highly conscious hip hop of the early 90s, and then it was sold out to rich white and Jewish guys in suits and ties who decided to pimp the lowest level culture back to the African American community and to all of America. So I think that's the level of the conversation that we need to deal with if we're going to actually understand the parameters under which the facade of this so-called race war happens.
I agree. I'd like to add one more component to it, is that people bought back that lowest common denominator culture willingly. People have willingly participated in the gang violence that comes with the drug war. They've willingly participated in this devious plot to a degree that merits some sort of self-responsibility. Someone can sell you a poison, but if you buy it and consume it, then there is some sort of agency still that merits a little bit of self-reflection in a way. I agree that everything you've talked about has had a deleterious effect on these communities. But what's the answer then? To simply submit to them and say it's not our fault, we can't do any better? If the same thing were happening to my hometown, I would look at the people who lived there and say, like, these things are in play, but where is our resistance? Where is the pushback? Because the corporatization of hip-hop doesn't fully explain why we have generation after generation of kids actually glorifying this gang violence and glorifying this destruction of the African American male.
The race to the bottom. There's tons of sense in what you're saying. And this is actually what a lot of the so-called left-right divide in politics comes down to. If you actually understand the way that people who are largely of the left political persuasion understand how humans create themselves, they predominantly believe that humans are created by their exterior circumstances, by their environment.
Or biological determinism.
Well, that's true. That's sort of like what I would call the shadow side of the left understanding, where you're basically just biologically destined. So I guess what I'm talking to is what we might sort of understand as the principle of both sides of this political spectrum that both need to be understood to understand how we solve our situation. So the left sort of like sees this sort of external determination, which at its worst goes to where you're talking about, where it's like pure biological determinism and where it's usually cloaked. On the right, or the conservative side, there's a strong principle of internal, that people are determined by their internal belief structure, by their principles, by their internal disciplines. That is also very true. I think both of these are true. So you can see the extreme sort of example on the left would be, of course, if someone is surrounded in chlorine gas, it doesn't matter how good their upbringing is or how disciplined they are or how many habits of wealth and creative construction they have. They're not going to be doing well. They're going to die. And then the extreme on the other side is that if somebody has the most incredible paradise that they live in, but they weren't brought up to have any self-discipline or don't know how to explain themselves to other people or don't know how to have habits that are constructive rather than destructive, then they're just going to end up killing themselves too. So we need both sides here in terms of our understanding to solve our situation. So I think that was really, really important. And so it's a both and scenario. At the same time, human beings are mimetic animals in many ways, and that also includes culturally. So this problem of the race to the bottom in hip hop culture, if you look at sort of like the studies of Rene Girard and this whole idea of humans as creatures who mimic each other, There's a lot to that. Language itself is a mimetic ritual, and so that if you don't know that English is possible or that the possibilities of communication exist, then you're never going to be able to do it. So yes, we're all responsible for the actions that we take in relationship to our environment, and we're also our brother and sister's keeper, and that we need to reconstruct our environment so that it supports a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom.
Yes. The key in doing this is to not lower expectations for one group of people and have a different set of expectations for another person.
This is embodied in the concept of the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Which is that if you want to almost cripple someone existentially, you remove their self-responsibility from them. It's kind of an infantilizing process. So in understanding that, yes, we are our brother's keeper.
When you deny a person's agency, you dehumanize them. Sad. That is no path to prosperity. Sad.
All of the media culture is seemingly oriented to infantilize us in our own world. You know, the media talks to us like we're 5 years old.
So instead of a tyranny of low expectations, we need a republic of courageous responsibility, you know, that we call ourselves toward and each other. This conversation, whether it's sort of white, black, and colors in between, or police, civilian, or folks who have connections to both, everyone in this situation should call each other to our most courageous communicative potentials possible. And there are some serious issues that are being blocked by a reactionary thin blue line, I believe, in terms of this. No one who wants to make serious progress thinks that calling all white police out for being racist or that shooting random police officers is anything productive. But at the same time, we need like the Sheriff Clarks and folks like that to really understand what they're trapped in here. It's interesting that folks like Sheriff Clark and the Dallas police chief, who seem very compassionate in his communication, they're all been trained in Israel. They haven't been trained in Iceland in terms of how to relate to the folks that they protect and serve. If you go back to that Dallas sniper situation, that he then gets taken out allegedly by a robot, and then there's no coming to terms with how it actually happened, what the motivations, whether he was the only one, whether he actually did it, what is the slippery slope of the roboticization coming home for domestic peacekeeping, supposedly, the further slippery slope domestically of what was installed under so-called Homeland Security, where this is an escalating strategy of tension that pits the peacekeepers, the police forces, against the populations that they are meant to work amongst and to protect everybody's rights. So that's my concern in all this.
Yeah, I think in all of this, the most fascinating part of it is not the race divide, it's that they blew up a guy with a robot. Is the killer robot here now? Where due process used to be?
We don't know.
Like, it doesn't seem like a bomb went off there, but whether it did or did not, they're still priming the water for that type of thing to happen.
There are basically two things which grow in parallel as society evolves, right? There is the power of our technology, and then there's the wisdom of us humans for how to manage the technology.
Robot power!
If technology grows faster than the wisdom, it's kind of like going into kindergarten and giving them a bunch of hand grenades to play with.
The robots are here. Some of them look a lot like us, others not so much. But robots are getting more mobile and smarter by the day, thanks to the US military funding research and development in advanced robots and artificial intelligence. Some people are excited about our evolving relationship with the machines.
They're a great tool that humans can use to make their lives better and make the world a safer place.
While others are deeply concerned about the dawn of intelligent, killer robots.
There is nothing that the U.S. develops in the military sphere that it does not want to weaponize.
A dead patsy can't tell you that he's a patsy.
You remember Lee Harvey Oswald was able to say, "I'm a patsy," before he was dead. I'm not asserting that's the deal in this case, but I believe that one of the Black Lives Matter's leaders pointed to the fact that it seems like every time that we are beginning to sort of gain some peaceful traction in terms of our actions, then some violence against police happens, and she referenced COINTELPRO. But of course, there's much higher level programs than COINTELPRO, and when you look at the idea of what was originally reported as multiple snipers in downtown Dallas, you begin to see situations that look similar to what Black Ops have done in other parts of the world. In the beginning of the Syrian so-called civil war, there were marches where there were snipers shooting at both sides there. Same thing in Ukrainian coup that was definitely sponsored by elements of the West. It is very possible that we're seeing the dynamics of what has been done as black operations abroad coming home to roost. Just the matter that they would say that they blew some guy up with a robot is important enough. It's an important enough step backward, I would say, to critique. But whether or not it happened and who it happened to are still very, very important things. I mean, just look at September 11th. Millions of destroyed lives and multiple destroyed countries later, the whole thing turns on who did it and why. This is, of course, the foundation of the trivia method is we need to figure out our grammar.
It seems like we're jumping to conclusions before we're examining the facts. So then when it comes time to examine the facts, we discard the ones that don't fit the conclusion we already jumped to in a moment of passion. It's the case universally that we need to understand what's going on, whether it's a domestic situation or an international situation or an interpersonal situation. We have to kind of stay cool until we understand what's going on. The media does not serve that agenda at all. The media's job is to prevent your cool head from being objective in a way. Minutes after a tragedy, there's an editorial article telling you exactly what happened, all neatly with a little bow on it, telling you exactly how to feel about it and what to do next. In moments of passion and in times of crisis, we get all fired up by these narratives. Weeks later, when the facts start trickling in, our conclusion is done, our mind is made up, and we don't have time for these facts that complicate the narrative every time. It's always more complicated than black and white.
Yeah, looking for a reliable news source, that's something else. It's sort of up to you.
There's two ways of looking at that, though. There's looking for a reliable source. On the other hand, there's looking for reliable information regardless of the source. That's easier to do. It's easier to find snippets of reliable information. It's hard to find a reliable source. They all have games they play, and they're all occasionally right, and then almost all the other times they're pushing some idea on you. So I try to find reliable information wherever I can get it instead of finding a source to trust all the information from.
Right. It's a good way of putting it.
And also comparison. Comparing two different angles on the same story can be very revealing as well.
No, don't fight. No, fight. Nazi scum! Nazi! Okay, my friend, please, go. Please, stop, please.
In Europe, there's another variant of this problem going on with the mass migration and loss of social cohesion going on in Europe.
What about it?
It's fucked. It's fucked. I don't think a lot of people in America realize how fucked it is and how long it's going to be fucked for.
I don't think a lot of people in America realize how fucked the Syrian war is and what their governments are doing. That's bringing all that about. There's a lot of things that are fucked that lead to a domino effect, and you gotta solve them so they don't happen, like the mass migration.
Isn't there a part of the sort of like large migration recently that's been so intense in Europe is due to the Syrian crisis?
Syria, Libya, Iraq. I mean, there's multiple wars that are bringing this about.
Yeah. It's the Levant. It seems like we have to have complex thinking that deals with the entirety of the structures that we're talking about. It's similar to in the United States where we talk about the mass migration from the South without talking about NAFTA and the drug war and that type of thing. And I do think there's something to it that it has to be done together, or else it puts a dehumanized face on these mass groups of people that are just sort of streaming across the border because they want to come here illegally. So I do see the idea that we have to be able to talk about all of this in a full, complex way. First of all, so that we can humanize everybody who's being impacted, and so that we can actually get to solutions, which includes prevention and then figuring out what we're going to do. And that's definitely the case in terms of Europe. And Europe is, of course, not all of the cultural tensions and the population tensions in Europe are due to the recent migration patterns, but a lot of it is. And at the same time, it does seem like if you have a state sponsorship of mass destruction and mass murder, there are hierarchies of criminality. And aggressive warfare was defined after World War II as the highest international crime. And it's obvious, if it's not a plan, instead of the migration patterns being blowback, it might be an additional positive consequence for the people who've actually planned these wars. I mean, that's a conspiratorial analysis, but to me, it's obvious that migration patterns have been utilized in history on purpose for political ends. NAFTA was not just to create the ability for capital to cross boundaries whenever it wanted to, but it also was to create a race to the bottom in the U.S. labor market. Everybody knows that to some extent. So it's very possible that similar or additional types of things are being done where after you have a campaign of a state-sponsored mass destruction and mass murder, you then get to reap the positive consequences of disrupting the European social fabric too.
There's absolutely a political agenda to the migration patterns. In Britain, a leaked memo from Tony Blair discussing how he wants to loosen UK border controls to allow in 2 million migrant refugees, or economic migrants in various cases. And he wanted to do that to get a block of new voters for the Labour Party that would last generations, because they would receive benefits from the Labour Party. They would become familiar and affectionate towards the Labour Party. In England, it was done to change the demographics of the voting bloc. That's very unscrupulous.
Very unscrupulous.
Because it's changing the fiber of the national politics without any conversation. A lot of the cultural instability was brought as a result of that. Not because necessarily of what religion the people are, but because of problems with assimilation and because of problems in other cultural values. Studies have been done for 15 years showing how more diverse communities have an eroded sense of social trust and social cohesion and social participation. And these studies have been confirmed by other similar studies. I mean, we know this now. The executive director of the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition talked about these studies and says,
"We can't ignore these findings. The big question we have to ask ourselves is, what do we do about it? What are the next steps?"
So how do we make this multiculturalism work if we have no choice but to have it? We still need to understand what makes it not work, what causes situations like Europe, and what could allow a positive assimilation of people. We can't just do these things without understanding how they work. Doing them blindly hasn't worked, and evidence is a clear example of that. Again, like you say, it wouldn't be a problem if we hadn't been in the Middle East for the last 100 years, and I agree. We should stop any involvement there right now. Let the peoples self-determine. But also, I think that people of Europe should have a right to self-determine as well.
Yes. All the peoples of the planet should have a right to self-determine. Meanwhile, the vast majorities of the planet's resources, that includes all courageous humans that are willing to kill or be killed to allegedly protect an ideal or a principle, that being used to destroy countries for very nebulous, dark political, geopolitical reasons, shows that we are wasting our human possibility here. And we're using it for very destructive ways. Another way that the United States could be involved in the Middle East would be to send our best permaculturalists over there, backed up by the armed services, to be able to do what Jeff Lawton did in Jordan, in the Salted region, where you can create food forests in 3 years. So there's other ways of being involved in the international community that goes beyond sort of whether we bomb countries or do we just sit at home. I don't believe that human beings are just created by our external circumstances. But if every single human that were born had a chance for the basics of shelter, food, clothing, communications, a bit of love, then a lot of our problems would immediately disappear. Yes, we would still have to figure out how to deal with cultural differences, what we want to do in terms of multiculturalism. Are there specific underlying national principles that can be the integrating force while we preserve our rich diversity? It's definitely not the case that all the sort of immigration has been a downside for Europe or England. So it should be looked at the upsides of diversity, the upsides of a multiculturalism, and yes, also look at the downsides of it. But in reality, what we're really dealing with is a destruction of social cohesion, civil participation in a large global fashion. That's really what we're dealing with it. And in that, people can then stoke tensions between people that are natural. And what I've seen is a lot of times in the idea of a common principle or a place for common discussion, most every social, cultural, ethnic, religious difference can be sorted out or agreed to disagree.
Provided there's an equal good faith effort to understand each other. But there's also those people who can't be reasoned with. Ideologues often can't be reasoned with because they put their ideology before the conversation that they could be having with people of different perspectives. So there are some conditions that need to be met before that kind of social progress can happen. And the problems we see in America, the problems we see in Europe, the problems we see in the Middle East are all very detrimental to the cycle of progress that we wish to see. And that's the game. How can some people create a condition continent-wide that prevents the people from making steps forward and civilization from taking steps forward?
One step forward, two step backward.
The problems that outside forces have been cultivating in the Middle East and outright causing in the Middle East are very clearly linked with mass migration out of the region and out of North Africa as well. There's been almost unfathomable abuse of power, abuse of humanity in that region for a long time. But the fact that these problems have been caused in the Middle East for a very long time is not ultimately an excuse to then go to Europe and raise hell against the people who took you in. The Swedes didn't do anything to the Middle Eastern people. We can understand the reason for the migration pattern without that being the same reason why there's turbulence after the migration happens. I think those are two different things.
Well, actually, we were brought here against our will. So, point is, I did not know that it was your car, and I certainly did not know about your daughter's wedding.
No, I welcomed you into my home. We broke bread together. Grandmama made you a cannoli. And how did you repay my generosity? With a rug made from the butt of a skunk butt rug. You disrespected me. You disrespected my grandmama, who I buried in that skunk butt rug. I told you never to show your face here again, but here you are, snooping around with this... What are you? A performer? What's with the costume?
There's entire ethnic enclave no-go zones throughout Europe right now. Some are ghettos, some are in suburbs. Some are Somalian and some are Uzbeki. There is a lot of variation as far as where the people are from. Regardless of the religions and countries of origin of these people, to me, there are even clearer reasons as to why there's these assimilation or integration problems. On one hand, you have the fact that the migrant population is 80% male, according to most estimates. So if you're bringing in a lot of people, regardless of where those people are from, and there's a radical gender disparity in that group, you're going to also be importing a gender disparity problem into your population. And young 20-something men, they need things to do. If they don't have anything to do, problems happen, and society often feels the brunt of those problems. If you have a lot of young working-age men without jobs, without an adequate number of females to mix with, from various cultures of various norms and attitudes regarding sexual conduct, there's going to be assimilation pains and turbulence, and in many cases conflict as well. So there's the demographics issue of having so many able-bodied men come in without a purpose there ready for them. It's hard for them to get jobs because they don't really speak Swedish. They don't necessarily have the same type of skills that play in the economy the same way. It's tough. It's going to be very tough. And when you get to a certain quantity, solving these problems becomes harder.
Yeah, it just seems kind of weird to take all these people from areas of a lot of turmoil and then to blend them in society. I wouldn't think that they would do that. I'd figured that they'd keep them in camps or certain areas to isolate them from rest of society until things get better. You said 80% of them are male? Because I don't know, I've seen a lot of pictures of women and children as well.
There are videos of a caravan of men, 8 wide, thousands of people long, and it's very, very difficult to even pick out a female among them.
Where are these statistics from? Like 80%?
UNICEF. They're basing their data off of asylum applications and what is self-reported.
What's to be done?
You gotta dig a lot of holes to plant a lot of fruit trees. So you get your young male testosterone moving in the right direction. And then some nice permacultural women who want to do some mixers. Well, definitely we all agree on the stop so-called interventionism until we deal with our cacocracy here in the West and NATO and Israel, where we have a psychopathological hierarchy, it appears, in terms of decisions around so-called foreign policy. So we need to resolve that issue. But then there are going to be these long-term tensions as different groups of people rub up against each other. So we have to figure out how to stop the wars.
That's not all we have to do. We also have to figure out more about how people blend successfully. And to get more of that happening, we also need to figure out what causes people to blend so unsuccessfully and figure out how to avoid that. Regardless of if we stop the wars, people are still going to be mixing. And until we understand the formula for success there and what's a formula for disaster there, I think that's a huge part of it as well. Because even if we stop the wars, even if the populations mixing aren't identical to the ones mixing today, that mixing will still happen. And we still want to get the positive sides of diversity. We need to understand how to do that without being overwhelmed by the negative sides of diversity. Because as we were talking about earlier, how there's often a loss of social trust in high diversity areas, those same studies found out that if that trust gets below a certain point, it's hard for even the positive sides of diversity to emerge. Often you do see the positive sides alongside the negative sides. But if the negative sides get so bad, you no longer get to see the positive sides. And I think that's what's happening in Europe. This was done very deceptively. In the case of England, all the people that were involved with Blair's memo to import these people, he ordered everyone to secrecy, so they couldn't even talk about immigration, pro or con, because he didn't want any public attention drawn to the immigration issue whatsoever, because he understood it would piss people off very much that this was done, and the reasons why it was done. And the chief proponents of the multiculturalism agenda in Europe have admitted how badly it's failed. It was 6 years ago when Angela Merkel said, multiculturalism has failed, utterly failed in Europe. David Cameron said something similar a few years back. But yet they keep doing it. And it's been done for reasons almost unrelated to the stated goal. Like, it's almost a weaponizing of cultural difference to influence the political situation one way or another.
That sounds about right in terms of the post-World War II era. I mean, this is an age-old construct, though, utilizing and or even creating enmity amongst different sects and factions and ethnic enclaves and different people. So it does play very readily into those that might want to exaggerate and politically utilize both sides or a multifaceted equation of cultural tension. I'm sure there's short-term political number issues that some politicians like to take advantage of, but in a longer, more macro sense, there's the idea that when there is conflict amongst peoples, then people look towards authoritarian measures, whether it's individuals or state apparati that can be used to, from the top down, apply law and order, as it might be termed.
Absolutely. For almost an entire continent to commit itself sight unseen to a irreversible agenda in this case, with seemingly ill effects across the board. It's a little more than just a bad idea, it seems. It seems like this conflict was created in a way. It was decided by the European elites that all these countries would have this open border policy, and that as soon as one country lets you into its borders, you are now free to move about all the other European countries. And Sweden is getting the worst of it, it seems, because they have the most generous benefits package, in a way.
And it might be really different if it were done in a situation where there was a strong commitment to principles of freedom in combination with an economy based on aggregating human creativity rather than stagnation caused by a weaponized monetary system that creates artificial scarcity. There's tons of work. There's never been a time in human history where there's been more work for us to do as human beings, where human mental and physical effort was needed more, and yet there's not enough money or there's not enough jobs. So this is obviously a false construct. Like my permaculture teacher, Larry Santoyo, said, he's like,
to say you're out of money is to say you're out of inches.
That's an absurdity. That's like if you're building a house, you're not out of inches. Money is a metric. So the question is, do we have enough mental and political social wherewithal, physical materials, human beings who have enough skills or willingness to learn to do the work that's needed to be done?
The problem is, though, that when your workforce increases by 1 million in a year, there's going to be fundamentally a shortage of employment opportunities. Especially when that 1 million people come from very different ethnic backgrounds, speaking very different languages, with very different cultural norms in a lot of cases.
Let's say you had a strong entrepreneurial fabric, entrepreneurial startup hubs all around Europe that didn't need to be in a specific language. Of course, the European continent is very multilingual. There's always been very little issues of being able to work across many different languages. So really, when it comes down to it, you don't have to have so-called joblessness when there's more people, especially when you're dealing with population leveling offs in terms of certain younger populations in some of these countries. So really what's missing is a 21st century version of an industrial base that's based on human creativity and physical wherewithal. So then immigrants of different national origins or different languages could then work with folks that they can communicate with in doing the work that needs to be done. I think it's an artificial construct, this whole problem of the economy. Our politicians are always talking about there's no economy. There's many economies, and there's lots of things that need to be done. Meanwhile, we have these monetary systems that are run by centuries-old so-called elites that utilize it as a weapon. Rather than to actually facilitate human creativity and full-on potential being realized, it's used to basically control wealth, to sit on wealth, to control land, to stop technology from reaching the light of day. So really, I really think if we unlock this top level, we're being sat upon by a intergenerational so-called elite that are power hungry. And for some reason, their whole project is designed upon controlling the entirety of humanity from enjoying the fruits of our cooperative human labor over the millennia. So I really think that's the point. We could unleash that in very quick time. Very quickly, we would actually get to what our real problems were. And I'm not saying there are not authentic inter-ethnic or intercultural issues that are going to need to be worked upon, both inside groups of their own, but also in between. But a lot of this stuff is just an artifice of a corrupt political system.
To some degree, but there are also economic factors that contribute. People without a high-level skill are very unlikely to be employed in a high-paying, high-skilled job. There are things in the economy that are scientific. Language barrier is one of those things that makes it hard to work. Yes, Europe speaks a lot of different languages, but Somali isn't one of them, unfortunately. In a survey by the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, they reported that German companies have hired only 54 migrants out of upwards of 1 million. 54. Institute for World Economics estimated that only 2% of recent migrants to Germany are employable. The director of the Center of Economics of Education in Munich said his research showed that 2/3 of migrants can't even read or write in their own native languages. It's a tough situation.
It's definitely a tough situation, but there's obvious solutions in many ways if we had the wherewithal and the political will. Human beings can learn a lot very, very quickly. I mean, let's take it back to the days of the guild where you disciplined yourself under an expert, Yes, you don't become a master or an expert in a few weeks, but you can become a very, very competent amateur in 2 months, really. You have two pathways. If you are interested in more mental work, you have cells of collaborative entrepreneurship where there's coding and digital skills are heavy. Or if you want to do more physical work, then it's permaculture cells. We have to repopulate the entire planet's agriculture infrastructure. There's no shortage of work for young men to do. There's a problem in the upper echelon of bullshit in the way here that's sitting on our heads. Okay, and yes, I agree, we haven't gone ahead and created these centers, but this is a national and international issue. Instead of investing in the types of resources in terms of a very hyper-local scenario that would end up helping people reskill themselves in 8 weeks or something like that, instead of that, we're invested in some type of derivatives and in white phosphorus and special operations and false flag terror units and depleted uranium and the most capable young men of the West going to aggressive warfare on behalf of the worst elements of the US and Israel. And I mean, so this is the nature of our reality here. It doesn't mean that there's an easy way to fix it, but the solutions are pretty easy. We know what to do. We just don't know how to get there, I think.
One thing we're learning is that unless these solutions are in place, it's unwise to bring this many people into your country at one time. I don't care where they're from. I don't care who they are. It's always going to be a challenge in any mass immigration situation. Unless the infrastructure is there to meet this challenge and to meet various aspects of that challenge, then it's not a wise policy.
Yeah, and clearly social and cultural and legal and ethical norms need to be enforced by the people of communities. And this is why some of this seems artificed in a way. Like, what was it, the New Year's Eve, where there was tons of assaults on women, that type of thing?
Cologne. Why do you think that is an artifice?
It seemed like there were police stand-downs. It was organized. So it was either some type of young Islamic sexual assault organized and or a stand down and collaboration of some aspect of the internal security forces that wanted to create a scenario. It could be a combination of both. But it seemed organized, right? It didn't just sort of happen out of nowhere.
From witness testimony, which is all we have because, the police didn't do a damn thing, we know that it was a tourist part of Cologne. It was like the central train station area there. That's not where the migrant population is based in that city. There are various suburbs around Cologne where these enclaves are. And these people came to the tourist part of town. Witnesses talk about how when you come into town, if you're just passing through Cologne, the two things you notice are this big church and this train station. And the witnesses feel that they kind of congregated at this town square. It's because when you're passing through Cologne, it's the first place everybody knows. From what we know about other cases of this kind of nature in Europe is that they are policed very differently than if these same crimes were perpetuated by German citizens. Police often don't even interfere because of the inevitable charges of racism. And in the no-go zones, police don't even go. If there's an ambulance, the ambulances have to get heavily armed police escort. In many cases, ambulances don't even go there because of how unwelcome outsiders are in these enclaves. It's a strange thing. It's hard to really say that the mass rape in Cologne is a contrived event, although it's a lot easier to say that about other events in Europe, such as the Paris Bataclan massacre and that situation, the truck incident in Nice. A lot of things have more of the shadow paramilitary fingerprint than the mass rape situation does.
Instead of immediate, sensational, narrative-driven press coverage, news agencies failed to report on the event until January 4th, 4 days afterwards. And when it did cover the event, the media initially attempted to downplay the migrant element by reporting that only a portion of the assailants were refugees. That may well be true, but it obscures the fact that the rest of the assailants that weren't refugees were migrants for another reason. All efforts were made to seemingly soften the bad news, which is not consistent with coverage of other events.
I guess I just wonder whether there is the potential for a cultural gladio aspect to this. Because even thinking back to sort of the Charlie Hebdo situation and the long history of Israeli intelligence networks utilized the cultural baiting of global Islam by these cartoon contests and that type of thing. A lot of that stuff is clearly run through Israeli intelligence networks. So I wonder whether there is the parameters in place for there to be a cultural gladio that goes hand in hand with the terrorist false flag operations or some type of deceptively orchestrated or proxy patsy operations. I just don't know. We don't have a lot of information, I guess.
There's kind of a blueprint for these contrived situations. I think we're getting into gladio territory, where this type of strife is fomented and cultivated for some not immediately obvious political aim. In Europe and Eastern Europe, since the end of World War II, there's been a network of paramilitary organizations that operate in a clandestine fashion to promote these types of conflict through massacres, shootings, bombings, misattributed terror of all kinds. This is a matter of public record at this point. It has been since the 50s. Much of this discussion falls under the umbrella of what is called Operation Gladio, where Gladio was a paramilitary organization funded and backed by NATO and the CIA in order to stay behind in Europe in case of a Soviet invasion. The other part of their mission was to operate in the domestic politics of Europe to prevent a rise of the communist ideology. The Soviet invasion never happened, so that left their secondary mission to become their primary mission, operating as kind of a shadowy network of subterfuge to dialectically manipulate the political sphere. And yes, a lot of these massacres and bombings, mass shootings in Europe follow this blueprint very closely. The blueprint of Gladio is to stage or conduct a terrorist attack and then make sure it's pinned on a political opponent of yours in order to damage their credibility. And what we see in Europe is that they've imported this extant Muslim population and are painting them as the sole perpetrators of conflict in Europe. This is kind of parallel to the cultural problems of assimilation. On one side, you've got the cultural problems of assimilation. That's different than the perpetuated notion of Islamic terrorism, which seems to be a Gladio-style put-on. The rapes and the fighting in the street and the clashing of mobs is different than the staging and blaming of terror on political opponents. It certainly doesn't make the conflict go away, but they're not both controlled in the same way. One is the setup and the other is the consequence.
But it's not necessarily just that, because sometimes they intersect in very interesting and contrived fashion, such as Charlie Hebdo, where basically you have this cultural conflict that takes place that has a longer history actually in France than just more recent migration issues. But that then intersects with false flag, terror, or hoax type of operation. We Are Not Charlie Hebdo, a book that was curated by Kevin Barrett, goes into a lot of the grammar and logic of that. And so I just think that incidents like that, the terror side of Gladio does have to do with exaggerating or exacerbating or deepening these alleged cultural tensions, many of which are very real. Going back to post-World War II, the Gladio that had its stance against the communist world in this bipolar Cold War world of Europe, where it was actually physically bifurcated in terms of Germany, there's these two layers of the intention of doing these false flag terrorist operations. And you laid this out very well, that you're attempting to pin vicious terrorism on your political enemy. So in terms of the post-World War II era, that was these parallel shadow paramilitary organizations staging terrorism and blaming it on Red Brigades, these communist left terrorist organizations. That's one level of it, but an even deeper level of it is the idea that no one was immune to the political tension, the strategy of tension of the day. And so there is a sense that an even deeper motive of this type of staged terrorism is to put fear into the heart of every average person of the nation. And then in this very modern era, it's very much spiked. It's meant to create an aura of total war, where everyone is under threat of total war. And then, of course, it's pinned on your desired political enemy.
Stay tuned for more of this very long conversation. Gladio Part 2, Wahhabism, and possible musical guest Donald J. Trump and the Centipedes. Who will win? The jovial conspiracy theorist Jeremiah Rothenberg Kushelowitz or the cantankerous taskmaster Mario Keith? Will the loser now be later to win? Find out next time on Zenith Radio Syndicate.
Participation necessary. Side effects include loss of appetite, sweaty palms, and the ability to maintain an erection. No CODs.